everybody. Welcome to our second ANFP meeting, Perspectives of the Food Council, MRA. We have two really great speakers today. We have Misha DeBrown. He just graduated from the UPA with a master's in urban studies, and he's about to start his PhD at the University of Twente, focused on food system transition pathways. And then we have Arnold van der Valk, one of the co-founders of the Food Council MRA, and he was also a former professor at Wageningen University in Research, the UvA and the VU. So welcome. Just a little background on us again. So we have Sophia. She is one of the co-founders of Taste Before You Waste. And then we have Otto Burma. He's unfortunately not here because he is at work. And there's me, Deidre. I did a double master's, one at Wageningen and one at AMS. And then we have Ying Su Lin, who is doing her PhD at the UVA and Urban Studies, focused on food surplus. So about ANFP, it was started in 2016, but took a break in 2018. Past year, we have revived it, even though it's a crazy one. And lastly, we are the academic branch of the Food Council MRA, and we are focused on connecting students, young practitioners, and civil society by discussing sometimes opposing views on food topics within Amsterdam. So today we will start with Misha's presentation, Growing the Grassroots. This should last about 15 minutes. And then we'll have Arnold van der Valk's presentation on Amsterdam food policy networks in the making. And that will also be about 15 minutes. And afterwards, we'll have a discussion for about 20-25 minutes. We'll have a short break for 5 minutes, and then we'll have participant networking at the end, where you signed up for either the general or the thesis participant networking session. So Misha, take it away.
Thank you, Deirdre. Let me just, can I stop sharing your screen as well? I think it will switch maybe if I do it.
I think so, yes. And for everybody, please write your questions in the chat, and we'll answer them in the discussion.
All right. Okay, I hope everybody can see it all right. So my name is Misha, and as Deirdre explained, I'm a recent graduate from the UvA. I did a master's thesis on on this topic, growing the grassroots urban agriculture, innovation, and local policy frameworks in Glasgow and Amsterdam. And I'm going to tell you a bit about this research. I'm going to go through it rather quickly because we have a limited time. So I'll jump right in with my research question, which is, how do local policy frameworks enable and constrain the practices of grassroots urban agriculture innovation? I abbreviate this as GUI, which is not an existing term, but it's based on a definition of grassroots innovation by Safing and Smith, which is networks of activists and organizations generating novel bottom-up solutions for sustainable development. These are solutions that respond to the local situation and the interests and values of the communities that are involved. And to be clear, that means we're not talking about more traditional types of urban agriculture, such as allotment gardening, which is more individual and less communal, and also harbors less of a radical potential for food system change. So why this research? The relevance of my research stems from the urban food question, which is a concept that some of you may be familiar with and some of you won't. Kevin Morgan phrases it as the issue of how to feed urban residents adequately and responsibly in a time of rapid urbanization, globalization, and looming climate and ecological disaster. This is, of course, a very big question, and very multidimensional. There's social and economic, cultural, political, ecological, but also moral dimensions to it. But in broad strokes, what I see is a top-down response to this urban food question, which you can see exemplified in the rise of urban food planning by local and regional authorities. So you see that cities are really claiming a seat at the table of food planning. They're beginning to act as food planners, as actors in this. But at the same time, you see a very strong bottom-up response. So you see food justice movements that are growing rapidly. And urban agriculture, which is of course the focus of my thesis, is one of the main exponents of this. And my research is situated really in the field of tension that exists between these two bottom-up and top-down responses to the urban food question. I chose two case studies and I compared these for my thesis. And the cases I chose were Glasgow and Amsterdam. But why these two cities? Of course, many other cities could have been chosen. And the reason is also practical because I did a semester abroad in Glasgow. But also these two cities have very lively urban agriculture scenes. There's lots of things happening there, but their policy approaches to it are very different. In Glasgow, you can see that they are just beginning to scratch the surface of what food policy and urban agriculture policy making. And in Amsterdam, they have a bit more experience with this, and at least ostensibly, they're much further developed in this regard. And so the question that I find interesting is whether that makes a difference for the development of grassroots urban agriculture movements. So my methodology is mainly qualitative, and I focus on the experience of the practitioners themselves. I interviewed urban growers, but also policymakers and civil servants that are involved with these topics. And in addition, I looked at policy documents and other relevant websites and documents. So let's go to the findings. In Glasgow, I don't know if any of you are familiar with this setting at all, but I found it very interesting because urban agriculture is very much alive there, but it takes place in the nooks and crannies of the city. So you really have to go looking for it. It's not as glamorous, it's not as hipster, you might say, as it is in Amsterdam, but it's definitely there. Especially there are a lot of community gardens there, which highlights the social aspect of growing. In terms of the policy context, you have two main policies that I want to talk about. The first is stalled spaces, which has been implemented by the Glasgow City Council in 2011, which allows communities of place rather than of interest to develop temporarily derelict sites in the cities and use it for urban growing or for other purposes, but it has been used a lot for community gardens. But this is explicitly a temporary solution. So in terms of land security, it doesn't do so much. The second one is the community asset transfer, which is mandated per the Community Empowerment Act of Scotland. And this allows communities, again, rather of place than of interest, to claim derelict sites and assets in the city, take on the responsibility and ownership of these spaces and for all kinds of social and ecological functions. Despite the potential of this scheme, it hasn't really been used so much. The other two policies that I mentioned here that are of the no strings attached kind, they are pledges and they are visions, but they don't really have teeth. So they don't do so much concretely for the movement of urban agriculture. What I've found in terms of enabling and constraining effects is that land access is by far the most prominent issue for urban growers, followed by financial stability and market opportunities. And you will see shortly that in Amsterdam, the focus is slightly different. Lastly, about the Glasgow context is this quote that I think sums up the attitude of policymakers towards urban agriculture pretty nicely. They're saying that the interesting thing about urban growing is not that it's fantastically carbon saving, it doesn't alleviate the levels of food poverty much, but it does develop a space in the city that's hopefully functional, practical, and beautiful, and B, it's a social space. So whilst they might grow vegetables, that's a side issue to the community growing. That is how it is perceived, at least. That this is not an objective truth, but there's an emphasis placed on the social aspect of urban growing rather than any ecological or even economical benefits that it might have. Lastly, in Glasgow, there are very promising developments taking place right now, which still have to crystallize before we can say much about it. But I want to mention them shortly. First is the Glasgow Food Growing Strategy, which is also mandated under the Community Empowerment Act, which is Scottish legislature. And the second is the Sustainable Food City Alliance, which is a UK-based organization that tries to build up an alliance between cities working towards more sustainable and safe, healthy food. And the third, and perhaps most interestingly, is the Glasgow Food Policy Partnership, which could be seen as a similar sort of organization as the Food Council MRA that we have here in Amsterdam. It's very much civil society led, and it's taken upon itself the mission to develop a very holistic and very ambitious Glasgow city food plan. Moving on to Amsterdam, we can see that the policy context here is mainly dominated by the voedselvisie, the food vision, which is anchored in the Agenda Groen of 2015 to 2018. This aims to subsidize green projects in urban agriculture in particular, and also do some things in terms of providing information for aspiring urban growers. At the same time, at this moment, we can see that the food vision is being worked into a food strategy. Actually, since I stopped my thesis in the summer, I haven't kept up with the developments, but maybe Arnold can tell more about where we stand now in that regard. And of course, the Food Council MRA is a very promising development in terms of democratizing food governance. Also, you will hear more about this, of course, from Arnold in a few moments. In terms of enabling and constraining urban agriculture, we see that the focus in Amsterdam, or rather the emphasis placed by the people I interviewed, is very much on the governance, meaning that the policy that is being put forward by the municipality may seem very supportive and very ambitious, but in a practical sense, it's very ambiguous, and it's perceived by many practitioners as a hindrance rather than a support. This is emphasized by almost everyone I spoke to, and even many civil servants admitted that it's far from perfect. At second and third place is land security and financial stability, which are, of course, enduring issues for any urban grower. So on the surface, there's a more explicit policy environment in Amsterdam than there is in Glasgow, which is more of an implicit policy environment. There's not much for urban agriculture explicitly, but it's also socially normative. The same as in Glasgow, the added value of urban agriculture is seen to lie not so much in its food growing capacity, but mainly in its potential to create awareness about healthy and sustainable food and to improve social cohesion and the physical attractiveness of the city. Yes, let's move. Well, one more thing that I want to mention at this slide is that one of the pictures you see at the bottom right corner is a poster for Lutkemeer, which may be something that some of you might recognize. It's a very hot topic in Amsterdam at the moment. There's a broad social activist movement organized around it, and it sort of exemplifies the ambiguous position that the municipality of Amsterdam has towards urban agriculture. At one hand, they think it's very nice to have it and they want to stimulate it. at the other hand, sometimes economic gains, well, they are more important, it seems. So in conclusion, I hope I'm still good on time.
Yes, I was just about to say you have 2 more minutes. So.
Okay, that's great. Then I have time to wrap this up. In conclusion, we can see between Glasgow and Amsterdam similarities, but also differences. We can see that in Glasgow, the policy framework is highly implicit. It's as much characterized by the lack of policy as it is by the policies that are in place. Whereas in Amsterdam, it's more explicitly stated what the vision is. But in both cities, the normative orientation of their policy frameworks is very much on the social aspect of urban growing. In terms of the enabling and constraining effects of these frameworks, we can see in Glasgow, land security is the most important concern of growers, whereas in Amsterdam, it's really the relationship with the municipality that is most important or most troubling for urban growers. And this description that I gave to these policy frameworks is as follows. In Glasgow, I call this a tentatively facilitating stance, whereas in Amsterdam, it's more proactively incentivizing. A couple of important points that I want to make lastly is that in Amsterdam, there's a much greater diversity and visibility of urban agriculture practices, which is a main difference. And also, despite the more supportive policy environment in Amsterdam, this proactively incentivizing stance, practitioners were generally much more skeptical and frustrated than the Glaswegian colleagues. Also because of the social normative orientation, market gardeners, so those are urban growers that grow with the intention of selling their produce, were generally most cynical about the policy that were intended to support them. They felt they were very much left out in this. And in both cities, we can see a clear disconnect between food policy making and the practices that are taking place on the ground. However, political awareness on the potential of urban agriculture is growing, and grassroots urban agriculture innovation is taking on a much more pronounced political dimension. And so in both cities, we can see very interesting governance processes unfolding in terms of the Food Council MRA, but also the Glasgow City Food Policy Council. Thank you. That was my presentation.
Thank you, Misha, for bringing up some really interesting discussion points. Arnold, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, take it away.
I hope that my screen share works. Is it visible?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, here we go. So I would like to tell you the story of the birth of Amsterdam's first food council, which aspires to become a new nexus, a new hub for an emerging food policy network in the Amsterdam metropolitan area. Why food in Amsterdam? Well, to state it very briefly, food is about 20% of all the consumer choices that we make on a daily basis. Food is about 25% of all the jobs in the services sector and about 10 to 15% of all the jobs in the industrial sector of the economy. Food is important because we tend to waste 30% of all the food, also in Amsterdam. Food is important because 15% of the youth in Amsterdam is obese in these days, and it's stabilizing, but it's still very high. And one more argument, and I could add a lot more to it, of course, but one more argument, 95% of all the food produced in the area around Amsterdam is exported. who was talking about short food supply chains. So there are a couple of good reasons to bother as a citizen of Amsterdam, a couple of good reasons to bother about food. And so I was involved in the establishment of a food council, a citizen initiative which aspires to become a stakeholder platform striving towards a sustainable, transparent and equitable food system in the region, in which all the citizens will have access to healthy, affordable and ecological food choices, regardless of their income, educational, cultural background. And we have various means, of course. I will come to that at the end of my speech also. But our major asset is the network that has developed, in my case, over 40 years practicing, teaching and doing research in Amsterdam and at Wageningen. And Food Council MRA wants to make a difference by forging local and regional coalitions, the networking function, which is primary, has been primary over the last few years, to forge links between governments, research, and commercial enterprises, to create new systems of distribution and sales. We are heavily involved in the short food supply chains and the task force which has been established here in the Netherlands. We are involved in adjustments in urban settings for healthy eating and physical exercise. And we're also heavily involved in creating or restoring relationships between urbanites, townspeople, and their food. One of our projects, our flagship, I think is the new flagship project, is the New Market project, where we try to add to existing street markets an element of new market stalls where with farmers' products. So we do not limit ourselves to the city of Amsterdam, although the vast majority of our stakeholders is situated in the municipality of Amsterdam, but we specifically have an eye on the region, because we think that one of our major objectives is to link producers and consumers. And the producers, of course, are situated in the environs of Amsterdam, in a region which at the moment, there are about 2.5 million inhabitants. It's all in all some 2,500 square kilometers, or for the Brits in our, it's about 1,000 square miles. There are about 30 municipalities, and it's a very prosperous region, the economic heart of the Netherlands. And if it comes to food, Amsterdam is the first harbor, the hub for cacao, a global hub even. We have a huge fishing harbor at IJmuiden, the largest fishing harbor in Europe. We have a major agricultural production, particularly horticulture, and it's all our agricultural products are all exported, particularly through the Schiphol airport. And it's not to forget the red circle. Amsterdam is home of a lot of large food processing companies such as Ahold, Verkade and Westzaan. So good reasons to turn our eyes on the food system in the Amsterdam metropolitan region. Food Council MRA promotes a system approach to food, which is opposed to a siloed approach, the way most governments still tend to approach food, from the silo of economy, for example, to create jobs, or from the silo of education, or from the silo of agriculture, or from the silo of an environment. No, I think we need to develop a much more integrated approach to the food system. And the food system, by the way, is a complex of elements. Think places, things, people, institutions on the one hand, and activities on the other hand, as you can see in this image. Activities which all together create a cycle of food production, distribution, processing, consumption, and the removal of food waste, of course. Here I would like to add that for most people living in the region at the moment, food is not perceived so much as a problem. Many people ask, what's wrong about a food system? Why bother? Why should, for example, why do you advocate government to intervene in the food system? Because we have the supermarkets, we have cheap food. We pay less than 10% of our monthly income to foods. Why bother? Well, I hope that most of you are aware of the fact that food features at the heart of environmental problems in these days, in climate change, the increasing pressure on our available scarce resources, the decrease of soil quality. Well, if you look at your television screen in the evening, you will see many of these problems passing by. One of the deeper causes of the food problem is the fact that we have been alienated from our food. We go to the supermarket, even in these days, children seem to think that hamburgers grow on trees. That's how alienated we have become. So it's definitely an important challenge for the Food Council to connect people with their food environment again. And we specifically try to practice this in the vein of creating food democracy. Food democracy is a concept invented by Professor Tim Lang, and it is an effort to achieve the right of all citizens to have access to a decent, affordable, health-enhancing diet grown in conditions in which they can have confidence. The concept was coined in the southern hemisphere, of course, but it's also very valid in the northern hemisphere in these days. And it's food democracy emphasizes the fulfillment of a human right to safe, nutritious food that has been justly produced. And it implies that ordinary people are getting together to establish the rules that encourage safeguarding the soil, water, and ecosystems that in the end we all depend upon. So much for food policy. Well, Food Council MRA was meant right from the beginning to be a kind of kernel, one element in a chain of cooperating food organizations. In fact, I've been one of the co-founders of two of the most important ones, which are relatively new, as you can see. One is the Food Council MRA, which is specifically a platform for civil initiatives. And the other one is the Foundation Food Connect, oftewel Stichting Voedsel Verbindt, which are, and I'm very happy to say that, they are a kind of twin organizations in these days, happily cooperating in many projects that we have established, but also they have their own character. One is that the Food Council, of course, organizes civil initiatives, whereas the Stichting Voedsel Verbindt particularly unites provinces, municipalities, corporations, and also a couple of private initiatives. And then finally, here you see a picture of the founding day, the day the Food Council was founded, at the Beurs van Berlage. And one of the elements, and this is a bridge towards the discussion that we may have about food policy and food policy networks in Amsterdam with respect to urban agriculture. Urban agriculture is perceived as one important element in the whole food system. And let me debunk one myth about food, urban agriculture. It's never going to be a primary source of food for the cities. So I think that Misha was right in stating that urban agriculture is perceived particularly and is appreciated particularly for the social dimension of it. That's also our take as Food Council MRA on urban agriculture. And I can finally I can give you two important. I can bring up two elements of news about urban agriculture in Amsterdam. One is that recently is established an organization called Samenwerking Stadslandbouw Amsterdam that unites the professional urban farmers in the city, those people who make an income from urban agriculture. And it's my honor to be a member of the founding group. And there is another organization recently established, and they both cooperate. And the other organization is het Solidariteitsnetwerk Buurttuinen Amsterdam. That's where the community gardens are united. So and that's a unique development, I think, that all these organizations in these days are developing critical mass. They are looking for cooperation. Well, that's what I would like to share with you. Hope that I was within my time limit, more or less.
Yes, you were. So thank you so much, Misha and Arnold. Yeah, I think very interesting developments in the city to reflect upon. So yeah, we can start actually straight away with the discussion. As I mentioned in the chat, you can use the chat to send your questions. Now that we've already started, you can also just say something like me or I have a question, because you will be asking the questions yourself. I just want to see your name come up in the chat so I can call on you. And we have one question already. I think that's a good one to start with, because that is for Misha. We can maybe first have a few questions just for Misha and just for Arnold, and then the majority of the discussion will be on the overlap of the two. So Gerrit-Jan Karschens, do you want to start with your question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, Misha, Arnold, thank you for your very interesting presentations. I have had a question for Misha. It was very interesting to hear that about this community asset transfer. Maybe I misunderstood it a bit, but maybe you can explain a bit further. Because it sounds a solution for also one of the key problems for many urban agriculture initiatives, which is temporarily of the activities in a certain location. And as I understood, the community asset transfer shifts the ownership of, well, the location to the people. And then you said that it was hardly used, and I was wondering why, because it sounds like an quite interesting way to also make these activities more permanent. Can you please elaborate a bit on it?
Yes, a good question. I also find this very curious, and I asked some civil servants about this. Of course, they couldn't fully give me an explanation as to why it was. It may have something to do that it was a rather recent development, which is also a bit complicated. So for some communities, it is a rather big responsibility to take on this ownership, and there's lots of things to think about. You have to be well organized, and so the city council was also a bit careful with shifting responsibility of some bits of land too soon, because if they do that and then after a year it appears that the community can't take care of the land any longer, then it will be the city council's job to take it back, and they don't want that. So it has to do with that thoroughness as well. But I also heard stories that the city council, and maybe there's a parallel here with Amsterdam, also has a certain stake in owning land. And so there were certain departments that were very reluctant to let go of certain pieces of land, because they felt that even though they were derelict at this moment in time, they could come in handy at a later point. There's a lot of derelict land in Glasgow, but the city is also changing. It's also gentrifying in certain areas, so they don't want to sell off their land all too quickly. I think that's the best answer I can give.
Yeah, thank you. And this asset transfer, does it really also include the transfer of ownership, or is it also more about the right of use of the land?
I think it can go both ways, but
Okay.
in most cases, we talked about actually transferring ownership rights. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks so much. We have one more question for Misha from Willy van der Broek. And in the meantime, if anyone has any questions for Arnold, please let me know in the chat. And now to Willy.
Yeah, thanks. I have a question for Misha. It's about the difference between Glasgow and Amsterdam. I looked at the composition of the political situation of the city council, and I see Green parties in Amsterdam, and let's say the very left parties from the Socialist, the Animal Party, and in Glasgow I see that the National Party is the biggest, and the Green Party is very minor in composition of the whole council. Do you think that that could already be an explanation on the difference between why food is relatively rather, let's say, poorly described in the policy?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I haven't looked at it from this sort of political angle. I'm not a political scientist, but if I'm not mistaken, the SNP is also very progressive and I think also very green leaning. So I would be surprised if that was the reason behind it. I think it's more, perhaps more the political tradition there that the government is less intervening in. So the urban grower movement does not expect the city council to do so much for them. Whereas here in the Netherlands, and maybe especially in Amsterdam, we do expect a lot from our local authorities. The expectations were a lot lower there, was my impression. But I cannot give a full explanation for this.
Well, I do agree that the National Party is, I know Scottish people are very proud on Scottish water, on Scottish energy. So why not on Scottish food? So I was wondering, how well does food grow in Glasgow? Do you know something about how much food is locally produced? Or is most food coming from, let's say, even from the mainland? Do you know
Well,
something about that?
Do you mean within the borders of Glasgow or Greater Glasgow?
Yeah, or even is it where is the food that is sold in Glasgow coming from anyway?
Yeah.
What I mean is it easy to grow food in Glasgow because the weather is quite harsh? So I
Yeah.
can imagine that it's quite difficult to grow food if you just have not much time and that it costs a lot of effort to do it there rather than do it in Amsterdam.
Yeah, well, the weather in Scotland is of course infamous, and in Glasgow even more so. I noticed it was raining almost 2/3 of the time, maybe even more. But even though that is true, Glasgow, or well, I should say that Scotland as a whole is of course a big food producer. It's a big food has a large food export. But Glasgow itself has very unhealthy eating habits. So although there's lots of great produce coming from Scotland and even from within Glasgow, I couldn't tell you how much food is grown within the borders of Glasgow itself, but I know that the food production in Scotland is considerable. This is mainly for export, and so you have this very contradictory situation where high quality produce is being exported, and a very poor quality food is being eaten inside Glasgow. And the awareness of the problems that this causes is growing, but it's in an early stage, I would say.
Yeah, but if you say food, do you mean then meat or also vegetables?
Also vegetables, potatoes and leeks and parsnips and, well, you name it, kale.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. I think we can move on to questions for Arnold. And I was wondering, Carlo Fahart, you asked a good question, I think. Can you maybe frame it towards Arnold and how you could collaborate with the Food Council MRA? Because I think that's the best entity to address on food issues, let's say.
Yes, of course, no problem. For me, it's very important that there is always a big pressure on the space we have, and there's always a discussion about who's going to be the new owner or participal owner of the space we have available, especially in the city, because in the city space is very costly. And what I see is that there are a lot of competitors who also want to have a piece of that pie. And for me, it's very important that we should be in contact with those parties to try to figure it out what is the best solution to get a good divide between energy or housing or mobility and of course food producing in the city. So I was wondering how we're going to achieve that.
Can I answer to that question? Because it touches at the heart of my discipline, of course.
It's all for you, Arnold. Take it away.
Yes, this question, I think the answer to it is spatial planning. I think we are really in need of a reinvention of spatial planning. I lived and taught spatial planning in the 1970s, 80s, 90s. And it was beyond doubt that spatial planning is crucial for densely inhabited countries such as the Netherlands. Whereas over the last 10 years, it seems that at least at the national level, spatial planning is practically gone. There is no more central the national there are no more national reports on spatial planning, and the idea is that the provinces and particularly the big cities will take up the job, which they don't. Sometimes they cannot do it, and that is one reason why. And I would that is my answer to your question. I think that we should as soon as possible make a strong plea for a new minister of spatial planning in the Netherlands, and carefully study the handbooks of spatial planning that were produced in the 1970s and 80s, because more than ever, I think we need some central direction of spatial planning, particularly in the city of Amsterdam.
For me, it's important, Arnold. An additional question then is, how do we get on the table of spatial planning then? Because that's very important.
In fact, most of the problem is solved already. In the programs of the large political parties for the next elections, almost every party has a paragraph with a plea for a new system of spatial planning and a minister of spatial planning.
Yeah, I read that, but if you are talking about urban farming, how do we not?
I get your point. Urban farming is a special case. It is not being acknowledged yet as a land use. For example, in the land allocation plans of Amsterdam, the bestemmingsplannen, urban agriculture is absent, as you can see. So I think this is definitely a challenge for the Amsterdam municipal authorities. And we made pleas. Food Council MRA has produced 2 manifestos already before the municipal elections, where we made a strong plea to introduce this category of land use, urban agriculture. It happened, and our government can simply consult their colleagues in New York and Chicago, where it has been introduced in their zoning plans recently.
All right, thank you.
And I think Giannis also had a good response to Carlo. Would you like to say your question or your statement, Giannis?
Yeah, I can maybe clarify that a little bit. I think what you also can see in Amsterdam is that many networks around food initiatives, but also around climate adaptation, creating a climate-proof city, green initiatives, they collaborate already a lot. So it's all about multifunctional land use and topping up goals. So in that sense, it's not necessarily that they are competing with each other, but rather I think you should look for synergies. And with green roofs, for example, you see this already happening. It contributes to water storage, can contribute to small examples of urban agriculture, recreation facilities, etc. So I think that's something that should be stimulated more.
I would like to respond to that if I can.
Yes, please, briefly.
Because what struck me was that many of the initiatives that had this sort of multidimensional approach, that were not only just about food production or about social cohesion or about climate mitigation, these sort of holistic projects were the most difficult to accommodate by the municipality. And perhaps urban planning is again the culprit, because it's very much silo-minded. It's very difficult to accommodate something that aims to bridge different silos. And that was a big frustration for people who were claiming that they are creating value in so many domains, but they are only being well, they're only being assessed on 1 or 2 specific domains, while it's so much more than just that.
If I can add to it, I think a special problem here in Amsterdam, and in fact you mentioned it already, Misha, and many of your respondents will have mentioned it. The Amsterdam city government is very much divided into silos. The silos are very strong in Amsterdam, which is a major problem for new issues such as food. So it's very difficult to develop a systems approach to food, the one I showed in the image. But it will happen over time, I think. It is happening, in fact. And I think Voedsel Verbindt both and the Food Council make a strong contribution to that emerging debate.
Yeah, thank you, Arnold. I wanted to ask Andrea, do you have anything to add? Because I think your question was along similar lines.
Sure. I mean, I think Arnold just kind of answered it there with the answer is that it's really like a slow process and it's a lot of advocacy work, but at least there are now 2 bodies established. That sounds like it's sort of advocacy mixed with education, I guess, especially for the city government. Perhaps it might not be the best strategy to come out so strongly, but I know that there's some very interesting examples around the world where cities are managing to deal with food, for example, by including it in their climate budget instead of perhaps being too demanding and say, no, you need to come up with like a food office or something like that. So just perhaps now that I'm thinking, I do have a question of where would this fit right now in the current Amsterdam political agenda? What is Amsterdam really strong about right now? And would food fit into that picture?
Yes, Arnold, is that a question for you?
Yes, I think I can bring up something about it. My experiences with the municipal authorities are, I told you already that first Amsterdam is still very much, its food policy is still very much divided into silos, and that doesn't change quickly. We had the same discussion already 5 years ago, and it's still ongoing. I think it's a cultural thing. Many politicians, particularly the coordinating alderman for food, keeps telling that he is very keen on breaking the walls between the silos, but that's not so easy. Because it's embedded into the political system in Amsterdam. That is one important element, but I think that it's changing. Another, and as you know, Andrea, improving health has been in the forefront. And the interesting thing is that also the health officials were almost demanding that the municipality would broaden, in spite of the success of Amsterdam op gezond gewicht, the famous Amsterdam program, these officials are demanding that the municipality broadens its scope, because you cannot improve the health situation if it doesn't include education, if it doesn't include environment, if it doesn't include lifestyles in general. So there is a tendency towards a more system approach to food, but it takes time.
Okay, thank you. I think this is a good bridge for Waz's question on food democracy.
I think Lamar has the answer.
Sorry about that.
Food democracy, yeah, I brought it up, so I guess I will also have to.
Still here, Moses? Am I saying the name wrong? Moses?
My question. Well, I can also reread. I think it's a very nice definition and a very nice approach. I didn't hear well who was the author, but my question is,
Sorry, Moses, we can't understand you. You're probably too far away from the microphone.
Oh, let me get closer. Yeah, my question was basically if the definition or the approach you are using for food democracy, if that also includes some elements as considered in, for instance, the right to food or food sovereignty as developed by the UN or the FAO. I'm asking this because I think the risk we can run is that we're missing out of some socio-cultural elements that are very important in developing food policies, as in this case for Amsterdam.
A very brief answer is the definition of food democracy that we promote, we as Food Council promote, is based upon the UN definitions. And I didn't mention it because it would take a lecture on itself, but food sovereignty is an important ingredient of food democracy. So the answer is yes. We are familiar with it and we promote it.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other questions of people that we haven't had today so far?
I think Andrea asked a question about COVID, like situation.
Yeah, oh yes, I see. It was just posted. Would you like to elaborate, Andrea?
Sure, because I guess also the past year with the pandemic, you can see the food movement kind of furthering as people, you know, like with lockdown measures, they have started to appreciate food a bit more and have had to learn to cook, and just so at least perhaps from an individual perspective, this may be happening, that people are reconnecting with food. And so I'm wondering then if even with the pandemic, there wasn't then this need to put a little bit more effort in the food system. Perhaps this is a question for both Misha and Arnold from their experiences.
Yes, I would like to respond to that with my, with some of my experiences in the Glasgow situation. I think this plays a bigger role there than perhaps in Amsterdam, also because the food habits that are there and the food system that is there is even more unsustainable and even more unhealthy than we have here. And so through my involvement in some of the grassroots networks that I talked about, I could see that when COVID unfolded, these networks were amazingly quick to respond and to protect the most vulnerable communities in the city that already have bad access to healthy food, to make sure that people in lockdown, perhaps food deserts is a bit of a too strong a term, but at least in places where people have bad access to good food, that these people were not left out. But it's interesting that this responsibility falls onto the shoulder of these grassroots networks. On the one hand, that is, of course, great to see that they can have this social and public health function. But on the other hand, it really points toward some of the weaknesses in the urban food system, indeed. So I'm not quite sure how the authorities by now have responded to this and whether they have taken any lessons from this at all. That might be a nice follow-up study for if you know any master students that are interested in this. But yeah, this is definitely the COVID definitely exacerbated some of the problems and pointed towards some of the weak spots.
Thank you, Misha. Maybe we can switch to Arnold for the following question.
Yes, I can add to it from a meeting I just had before this presentation with Stadslandbouw Nederland, which is an organization that brings together practitioners in urban agriculture in the Netherlands. And they told me that in some instances, the turnabout of what's it called? The community supported agriculture has gone up by 400%. So many of the entrepreneurs have problems in organizing their infrastructure now. And we have a person in our midst who asked a question, but who can answer the question better than I can probably. Carlo Verhart knows all about it, because I think that it's an important part of his daily work in these days to handle the consequences of the COVID crisis in the Amsterdam metropolitan region. But I know from my own observations that also here in Amsterdam, the production has gone up a lot, many circuits. But Carlo knows more about it. Maybe Carlo will help me. Carlo, are you still?
Yes, of course, Arnold. I had to unmute myself. So yeah, I think that one of the few good things that COVID-19 has brought to us is that we see a very big attention span to our food use. There are two questions people want to know. Where is my food grown and how healthy is it? And what can food do for me to stay in shape, to have a good defense mechanism in my own body to avoid COVID? So what we see is that there is a lot of interest in locally produced food. And we also thought that it was mainly for health issues and also for a lack of food from other countries. But one of the most important reasons we have seen so far is that to help your local food producers with their economic status. You see there's a very big social commitment for people to help their bakery or their butcher or their grocery man. And even though we go to farmers who produce their food and sell it on their own how do you call that? Erf, I don't know the right word for but on their own area where they produce the food. So I think that we have a momentum here that we should use, and I see that with all the participants we have in Voedselverbind, but also with locally how do you call national parties who are also very interested in how we can solve a food issue and we can shorten the change. And I think urban agriculture is very important to that, to get acquainted with the way of food is produced, and not only for students or young children, but also for us, for ourselves, that we are familiar with how it's produced and what a farmer has to do to get something out of the ground. So I think we have to make use of this momentum and try to get it also in the policies of the local municipalities.
It's a pity that Willy, I think, has gone now, but Willy van der Broek knows a lot about it.
Yes.
Are you still here?
Yeah, he's still here, I think. In any case, I think it's time for a break, more or less, so we can refresh a bit before the breakout groups. I'd like to thank everyone for participating so actively in the discussion. You've all chosen a breakout room in advance, so you will be automatically sent there after the break. We will start at 5:15, 5:15. And yeah, we will have the general breakout session and a thesis related breakout session. So grab a drink, do whatever you like to do, and we'll see you in a bit.
Diedrich, do you tell us how to get to the working spaces? Or
Connie, it's automatic through Zoom. So Connie will just press a button and then we all go.
Okay.
Yeah. Hello.
Hello.
I do have to quit by in 30 minutes because I always do the cooking. That's a kind of holy commitment I made to my wife.
It's a very nice one.
Okay.
Unfortunately, to announce like eventually all the people joined assigned for thesis networking did not stay.
Oh,
okay,
so
we're all in the
there's
same
nobody in the
group
thesis network?
Yes, so I think there is like I won't like I think we could just remain like a discussion here.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah,
fine.
perfect.
And then in the future, we need to figure out if that is something that we want to continue to do. But anyways, I wanted to welcome everybody back. I think we had a really fruitful discussion about food policy networks and how the pandemic is affecting that and how maybe stacking functions in the future could be a solution. So unfortunately, there's nobody in the thesis networking session, so we're just gonna stay here and have a great discussion. So, does anybody have anything that they would like to ask? I think just unmute your mic and start talking.
Can I, Diedrich?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I just noticed that Willy van den Broek is back again. Oh no, he's gone. Because I'm very curious about his experiences with COVID. I think that AMS has started up a specific project around COVID. I was interested, but he's not here anymore. So let's skip
Maybe when he comes back.
that one. Yeah.
Because I also think that's really interesting how, the meaning of food is changing for people because the meaning of life is changing as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was, sorry, for me, it was really a big surprise to hear that COVID is such a huge stimulus for local food production. It's not, maybe somebody, some of the attendants can explain to me, but it's not quite clear to me why that is. Is there anybody who has thoughts about this?
Yeah, maybe I've two thoughts about this. I'm living in the city of Rotterdam, and there you have the platform Rechtstreeks, where you can order food from local producers via internet, and then once a week you can pick it up somewhere in your neighborhood. And this platform has also exploded the last couple of months. And I think it's because of two things. We have more time, we are more at home. So we have more time to cook, prepare food. And I think also COVID showed our reliance on this global food system. Mm-hmm. And that some things were not available, for example, or also the way we went to the supermarket the first few weeks in the lockdown in the spring, I think last year. I think that also made people aware that we could also have a different system or so, and now they have the time. And I think for those who still are employed, for example, they have also maybe the resources available and to buy then the locally produced foods.
Giannis, Cornelia was asking if you could repeat the name of the platform or maybe as well share the link to it.
Yeah, we'll put it in the chat.
Okay.
Maybe I can.
Oh, sorry.
No, I just wanted maybe to also just react to that question or comment.
Yeah.
And maybe before I do that, Deidre and Arnold, nice job with the meeting today. Really enjoyed the presentations and the discussion. And what I notice is, and I think it was already mentioned, so you're spending a lot of time on Zoom and in front of the computer. So I'm really looking to get out of the house more and do something with my hands. It's something that I wasn't very successful at last year, but is really an ambition for me for this year, especially the next couple of months when the weather gets a little bit better. And I'm actually still looking for ways to do things with my hands and probably food related, ideally. So if you know of any nice initiatives, then let me know. I have some ideas, but looking for other suggestions. And what you mentioned, Janis, the reason I thought this was very interesting is because I've had a question actually from some people in Romania where they were really struggling with the markets being closed. So the producers were having a very hard time getting their food to consumers, actually. And they were actually looking for platforms, ideally open source platforms or things that could be easily transferable to facilitate that the producers could actually get their food to markets. This was a very big challenge the last couple of months. So thanks a lot for the tip.
Yeah, and that also happened here in Arizona when I first moved here. There was a lot of surplus food that the farmers had, and so then they started this thing at the high school where every Thursday you could go from a certain amount of time and they would just give you free produce because they had so much and the distribution system wasn't working. So yeah, I think it has highlighted a lot of places where innovation, both technical and social, can improve the future food system.
Can I respond to Cornelia's question? Because there's an immediate answer to your question, Cornelia. If it comes to being active and using your hands, Voedseltuin Eiplein, where I'm one of the members, is always open for people. We work 3 days a week normally, starting in March. At this moment, we practice 2 days a week. It's on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Saturdays. You can simply drop by, see if you like it, and it's up to you how many hours you spend. It's opposite the central station, so it's probably not too far away for you. And we're always happy to invite other people to join us, even if you can't make a commitment, because I know that you're very busy. But in these days, probably you need to have some recreation. I can highly recommend it. That is one thing. But it's not just an invitation. I would also like to add to it. From my professional perspective, I've been in many Zoom discussions over the last few weeks because we are involved, Food Council MRA is involved in the establishment of 2 associations for urban farmers. I mentioned it already. One is called Samenwerking Stadslandbouw Amsterdam. It's an organization for professional food growers. And the other one is a coalition for community gardens. And particularly in the meetings with the last group, I noticed that at the moment there's a huge need in the city for people who want to spend their time outside, because it's the only place where you can meet other people. And the municipality of Amsterdam doesn't seem to be aware of that. I know that you are active, for example, at Pakhuis de Zwijger and those circles. I think this is an issue that we definitely have to advocate there, that there's a serious need to establish or to start new community gardens. hundreds of people could be active there. And there are so many greens where only dogs are allowed, where we could create new gardens. I think this is really an issue that maybe you should also bring up in your circles.
Good points. I think it's already something that was on my mind, not from the direction that you just mentioned it, but it's something I will think about.
Does anybody have any more comments? Raise your hand. No?
I actually had one other question, and I think actually Sophia, why don't you go first, because I thought I think you were also trying to ask a question.
Well, mine was actually related just to Arnold's because you were saying you weren't entirely sure why it was, and I think for me personally it was a thing of breaking habits, because I think a lot of food questions are hard to change or address because people do it in a very habitual way, the way they buy food, the way they cook food. It's sort of a food culture. And when the convenience broke away from the supermarkets, that was for me the point where I found it easier to switch to other alternatives. So if it's not convenient anymore to go to the supermarket, then you're like, okay, what are the alternatives? Maybe I order food, but if I'm ordering food, then I may as well not order it at the supermarket, but rather somewhere that I actually that I can actually support. So that was for me a big one, I think. But yeah, that was it. Just a little point. So go ahead.
Yeah, so my other question, and it's something that I thought about maybe posing earlier on in the discussion with Misha also, that was more policy driven and related to your story, Arno, that you shared about the Food Council. I'm wondering if you see, or what you see are developments or shifts with respect to the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, which as far as I can tell is really, let's say, one of the main culprits from an environmental perspective on a European level. So I'm curious if you see COVID-19 shifting the CAP policy at all, or what maybe you can reflect a little bit on that. Your first reaction is not overly positive.
I actually, if you don't mind, Arnold. So I know that the FAO has propositioned the changing of the CAP to a more regenerative agricultural way of farming. And also in November 2019, the Dutch government put in a policy brief for circular agriculture. So I think it's changing, but it would be interesting to see how COVID has pushed that even further on more of the European level as well.
If I can add to that, I'm afraid it hasn't changed much yet. As you know, Common Agricultural Policy is a kind of mammoth tanker. It takes years, if not decades, to change something. My colleague Jan Willem van der Schans, who is a member of the Green Deal group of advisors in Brussels, he told me that there are many discussions going on in the offices, but it hasn't changed much in the official policies. That takes many years of deliberations. So the answer is no, I don't think that it has changed much so far.
Thanks.
To my knowledge.
Do you have an estimate of when you think things will change? I know that's a hard question.
Of course, we have the Green Deal, and I think that a lot of COVID-inspired interventions will be part of the Green Deal eventually.
Yeah, and that was also, let's say, the spirit of my question, right? So the fact that you typically need a sort of crisis moment in order to change these institutions, and we, as you just mentioned, the cap is something that is very difficult to change. But if there was going to be a moment, then this should be it. It's not just with respect to the food policy, but mobility policy, all kinds of other sectors. So. And I think also listening to to Misha's story is very interesting. But what I think I find a bit discouraging or disappointing the last few years is that there's so much focus on these small scale bottom up initiatives on the one hand, which is great, but you still need that structural reform. And that's what that's a little bit what I'm looking for, but not necessarily seeing it. So
you're absolutely right. One of the tragic things about agricultural policy is that it excludes all these innovations. So it's extremely conservative. And as you know, the agricultural budget has just been approved by the ministers of agriculture, and a lot of people complained about it because it's not in the spirit of the Green Deal that Frans Timmermans has promoted. So it takes a lot of political pressure, I think. And this is something in general. I feel that in order to raise the status of urban agriculture, we need to get organized and turn the movement of all these nice people, turn it into a political force. The way it has happened in New York, I noticed a couple of years ago. But that's another story, maybe another meeting of ANFP.
Yeah, so I think we're at the end of our time, but maybe we can try to think of a way that we can continue these discussions after the event. So we'll brainstorm with the group. I just wanted to let you guys know that we have 2 more upcoming events. In March, we will have the Food Surplus, which will be with Ying Su Lin at the UVA, and as well as Sophia with Taste Before You Waste. And then for May, we have decided to do social versus technical solutions for the future. So thank you everybody for coming. We will send you an email afterwards with a link to our YouTube page with this recording, as well as the chat and some other documents that you might find interesting. So thank you. Have a great day or night.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks again.
Bye.
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 And thank you, Ying Su Lin, for facilitating us.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks for organizing.